The stage lights burned hot against the velvet backdrop as the debate hall filled with an energy that felt more like a heavyweight fight than a political discussion. Cameras clicked, pens scratched, and every seat in the auditorium was filled. On one side of the stage sat Governor Greg Abbott, his posture calm but commanding, his expression unreadable. Across from him, California Governor Gavin Newsom leaned back in his chair, the faint trace of a smirk dancing at the corner of his mouth. The topic was serious: immigration, border security, and the challenges each state faced. But Newsom, known for his sharp tongue and flashy presence, seemed more interested in scoring theatrical points than addressing policy. After Abbott delivered a measured defense of Texas's border strategies, Newsom tilted his head, his grin widening. "Well," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm, "I suppose when you spend all day sitting down, it's easy to think the border problem looks simple. Maybe if you were out there walking it, Governor, you'd see things differently." The words hung in the air like poison. The audience gasped, audible, sharp, like a single collective breath sucked out of the room. A murmur rippled across the crowd as journalists' pens froze in midair. Even the moderator blinked, stunned, before quickly looking to Abbott. The insult wasn't subtle. It was a direct jab at the very wheelchair Abbott has never hidden, the visible reminder of the accident that changed his life but never broke his resolve. Newsom's smirk deepened, clearly pleased with himself, convinced the line would land as a witty blow. A few nervous chuckles came from his side of the aisle, but most of the audience sat in stunned silence, uneasy with the cheap shot. Greg Abbott didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shift in his chair. He simply placed his hands on the desk before him, his expression calm but his eyes sharpened like steel under fire. The tension built as the camera zoomed closer, catching every flicker of restraint on his face. In that moment, everyone knew, Abbott's response wasn't just going to be political. It was going to be personal. And Gavin Newsom had no idea what was about to hit him. The silence after Newsom's jab was heavy, the kind that presses on everyone's chest. Reporters shifted in their seats, pens hovering, waiting for the explosion they were certain was about to erupt. But Greg Abbott didn't lash out. He didn't fumble or retreat. Instead, he leaned slightly closer to his microphone, his voice low, steady, and deliberate. "Governor Newsom," Abbott began, his tone calm as a surgeon's hand, "you just told on yourself. You think strength is about standing tall. But in Texas, we know strength is about standing firm, no matter where life puts you." The crowd stirred, some clapping tentatively, others nodding, sensing that Abbott was setting the stage for something bigger. Newsom's grin faltered, just slightly, but he leaned back again, arms crossed, as if daring Abbott to continue. Abbott did. "You see, I didn't choose this chair. But I did choose not to let it define me. I chose to keep fighting, to keep leading, and to keep serving. Every day I wake up, I know what real struggle looks like. And unlike some governors, I don't run from it or hide behind cameras. I face it head-on." Applause broke out, this time louder, rolling across the auditorium. Abbott's voice rose just enough to cut through the noise without shouting. "So if you think mocking a wheelchair makes you clever, Governor, you're wrong. It makes you small. Texans don't follow men who laugh at weakness. Texans follow leaders who turn obstacles into victories." The audience erupted, claps, cheers, and even a chant of "Abbott! Abbott!" Newsom's smirk twitched into something tighter, less sure. His jab had landed, but Abbott had turned it into a weapon, one now pointed straight back at him. And yet, Abbott wasn't done. He paused, let the cheers fade slightly, then delivered the line that shifted the entire night. "You mocked this chair. But this chair has carried me further than your pride ever will." The room thundered. Social media exploded. And for the first time that evening, Gavin Newsom had nothing to say. The moderators exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsure how to redirect after Abbott's thunderous response. But Abbott wasn't waiting for them. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Newsom, voice steady but carrying the force of a hammer striking steel. "You know, Gavin," Abbott said, his Texas drawl unmistakable, "you can laugh at this chair all you want. But let me tell you something, it's from this chair that I've signed laws that kept my state open when yours was locked down. From this chair, I've defended families and secured our border while you let chaos run wild. From this chair, I've done more for working people than you have standing on your 2 feet in front of every camera you can find." The crowd erupted in cheers, some rising to their feet, the chant of "Texas! Texas!" rumbling through the hall. Newsom's jaw tightened, his smirk gone now, replaced by a stiff smile that looked more like discomfort than confidence. Abbott's tone softened, but his words cut deeper. "This chair doesn't hold me back. It reminds me every day that life is about fighting harder when the odds are against you. You think it's weakness? Texans know better. They see strength in resilience. They see grit in never backing down. And I'll tell you what, I'd rather lead from this chair than hide behind Hollywood smiles and empty promises." The applause was deafening now, journalists scribbling furiously as cameras zoomed in on Newsom's face. His attempt at ridicule had detonated in his hands, and Abbott had turned it into a rallying cry that resonated far beyond the room. Newsom shifted uncomfortably, finally forcing a laugh that came out hollow. "Well, Governor, you certainly know how to spin a speech," he muttered, trying to recover. But the damage was done. The audience wasn't with him anymore. They were with Abbott. And deep down, Gavin Newsom knew he had handed Abbott a weapon he could wield not just tonight, but in every fight to come. The cameras panned across the crowd, capturing faces lit up with energy. College students waved Texas flags, veterans in the front row stood proudly, and even undecided voters leaned forward, captivated. The energy in the room was no longer neutral, it was firmly with Abbott. Newsom, sensing his grip slipping, tried to claw back the narrative. He leaned into his microphone, voice dripping with forced humor. All right, Greg. You've made your point. But if we're being honest, Texas isn't exactly a shining example of compassion. Maybe that chair makes you tough, but your policies sure don't make life easier for people in your state." It was an attempt to shift the battlefield, away from the cheap shot, back to policy. But the audience wasn't buying it. The earlier insult still hung heavy in the air, and Abbott wasn't about to let Newsom wriggle free. He smiled, not a mocking grin, but a quiet, controlled expression. "Compassion?" Abbott echoed. "Governor Newsom, I know a thing or two about compassion. It's not throwing slogans on a billboard. It's not taking selfies in front of the homeless crisis you refuse to solve. Compassion is action. And while you mock my chair, I've been using it to deliver results. Texans have jobs, security, and dignity. Californians are fleeing your state in record numbers just to find those things in mine." The auditorium erupted again. Journalists tapped furiously at their keyboards, headlines already forming in their minds. Newsom shifted in his seat, his attempt at levity swallowed by the weight of Abbott's counterattack. Abbott leaned in, his voice firm but unwavering. "You tried to belittle me, Governor. But the truth is, you've belittled the people who put their faith in you. They trusted you with leadership, and instead, you gave them sound bites. That's the real weakness here, not a chair, not a disability, but a leader who mistakes arrogance for vision." The crowd exploded. The chant began again, louder this time, "Abbott! Abbott! Abbott!" And for the first time that night, Gavin Newsom's polished confidence cracked. His smirk was gone. His eyes darted nervously, realizing the crowd wasn't laughing with him anymore. They were laughing at him. By now, the debate hall felt less like a policy forum and more like a showdown written for history books. The crowd leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every exchange. Abbott sat steady, his wheelchair no longer the subject of ridicule, but the symbol of resilience. Newsom, meanwhile, shifted uneasily, his trademark smirk replaced with thin lips and darting glances. Abbott let the pause linger before striking again. His tone was firm, deliberate, every word landing like a hammer on steel. "Governor Newsom," he said, "you run a state with the biggest stage in America. Hollywood, tech giants, billionaires on every corner. And yet, with all that wealth, all that spotlight, you can't keep the lights on, can't keep the streets safe, can't even keep your own people from leaving in droves. Texans don't run from Texas. Californians run from California." The crowd erupted again, laughter mixed with applause. Newsom clenched his jaw, forcing another laugh, but it landed flat. The audience was no longer on his side. Abbott continued, his voice steady as ever. "You want to mock this chair? Go ahead. But while you laugh, I'll remind you, it was from this chair that I signed the strongest border security measures in the country. From this chair, I've fought for jobs that pay real wages. From this chair, I've led Texas to become the #1 state for business in America. You call it weakness? Texans call it leadership." The chant of "Abbott! Abbott!" roared through the auditorium once more, this time with even greater force. The camera zoomed in on Newsom's face, capturing the moment his polished exterior finally cracked. And Abbott, with perfect timing, delivered the final blow of the round. "You see, Governor, in California you measure leaders by their smiles. In Texas, we measure them by their results. And that's why tonight, the only thing your smirk managed to accomplish, was proving my point." The audience exploded, reporters' keyboards clicked frantically, and Gavin Newsom sat frozen, the same smirk that had started this battle now gone, replaced by silence. By now, the atmosphere in the debate hall had transformed completely. What had started as Newsom's confident showcase had turned into Abbott's stage. The energy was no longer scattered, it was electric, flowing straight toward the Texas governor like a current. Newsom adjusted his tie, forcing composure, and leaned toward the microphone. "Greg, you keep talking about results," he said, his tone sharper now, stripped of the earlier smugness. "But Texas ranks near the bottom in healthcare access, in education funding, and in environmental protections. Maybe your results aren't the ones we should be applauding." The line landed with some nods from his side of the audience, but it lacked the punch he had hoped for. It sounded defensive, even desperate, especially after his earlier blunder. Abbott, however, didn't hesitate. He clasped his hands together on the desk and replied with the kind of precision that comes from years of courtroom battles. "Governor Newsom, you can cherry-pick statistics all night long. But here's the truth, people vote with their feet. And while you boast about California's values, they're leaving your state by the hundreds of thousands. Where are they going? Texas. Why? Because Texans enjoy freedom, opportunity, and safety. We don't just talk about results, people come here to live them." The crowd roared. The chant of "Texas! Texas!" filled the air again, echoing off the walls. Even those in the neutral press section couldn't hide their surprise. Abbott wasn't just defending himself, he was dismantling Newsom's argument piece by piece. Abbott leaned slightly forward, his eyes piercing through the noise. "You mocked this chair, Governor. But this chair has outpaced your policies, your promises, and your state's decline. Texans don't measure success in slogans. We measure it in the lives of families who thrive, in businesses that grow, and in communities that stand strong. That's the difference between California gloss and Texas grit." Newsom blinked, his silence louder than any retort. The moderator, sensing the imbalance on stage, tried to intervene. "Gentlemen, let's steer this back to solutions," he said quickly. But the audience wasn't ready to move on. They wanted more. The roar of clapping and shouts of "Go Abbott!" drowned out the moderator's attempt. Newsom adjusted his cufflinks, his face composed but his voice carrying a defensive edge. "Governor Abbott, you keep saying people are leaving California. But Texas isn't some promised land. You've got power grid failures, you've got poverty, you've got challenges, too. Don't act like you're running paradise. It was a fair swing, but it landed flat. The audience, still caught in the aftershocks of his earlier insult, wasn't generous with their reception. A few polite claps scattered across the room, but nothing compared to the thunder Abbott had drawn. Abbott's eyes narrowed just enough to show focus, not anger. His reply came smooth, crisp, and sharp as glass. You're right, Gavin. Texas isn't perfect. No state is. But here's the difference: when Texans face a storm, we fight through it. When Californians face a storm, their governor runs to a camera and blames somebody else. The crowd exploded. Laughter, applause, even stomps shook the hall. Newsom forced a smile, but it didn't mask the tightening in his jaw. Abbott continued, his voice rising over the cheers. You want to mock my chair, Governor? That's fine. But while you were mocking, Texans were working. While you were smiling for Hollywood, Texans were keeping the lights on for America. And I promise you this, the people watching tonight know which kind of leadership this country needs. The chant of Abbott, Abbott, Abbott swelled again, rattling the walls. Newsom tried to speak, but his words were swallowed by the noise. For the first time in his political career, his charm and wit weren't enough. He had poked at a man who built his entire legacy on resilience, and Abbott had turned the moment into his greatest weapon. The camera zoomed in on Greg Abbott as the audience roared, their cheers refusing to die down. The chant of Abbott, Abbott echoed like thunder, rattling the confidence Gavin Newsom had carried into the debate. His earlier smirk was nowhere to be seen. Abbott lifted his hand gently, signaling for quiet. The crowd gradually settled, though the energy still pulsed in the room like a coiled spring ready to explode again. Abbott leaned forward, his voice calm, measured, but unmistakably commanding. Governor Newsom, Abbott said, his tone deliberate, you've spent years mocking others, pretending California's failures are someone else's fault. But tonight, you decided to mock me. You mocked this chair. And here's the irony, this chair has more backbone than your entire administration. The crowd gasped, then erupted into applause and laughter. The line hit like lightning, shaking the hall and searing into every headline waiting to be written. Abbott continued, his words slow and sharp. You see, Texans don't follow leaders who sneer. They follow leaders who serve. This chair has never stopped me from fighting for my people, from securing my state, from protecting families, and from standing up to arrogance like yours. You think you scored a point with that cheap shot? No, Governor, you just showed America the difference between showmanship and statesmanship. The applause swelled again, some in the audience rising to their feet. Newsom shifted in his seat, his polished veneer cracking further, his silence louder than any defense he could muster. Abbott didn't stop. So while you mock, I'll keep building. While you laugh, I'll keep leading. And while you try to belittle me, I'll remind America that strength isn't about standing tall, it's about standing firm. The crowd roared, the chant of Texas. Texas, overtaking the room once more. Newsom lowered his gaze, for the first time in the night, looking like the man on defense. The room was electric, the air charged with the weight of Abbott's words. Newsom's polished exterior, the easy grin, the relaxed posture, had crumbled. His fingers tapped nervously on the desk, his eyes darting toward the moderator as if begging for rescue. But there was none coming. The audience wanted resolution, and Abbott wasn't finished. He leaned forward again, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who knew the moment belonged to him. Governor Newsom, you mocked what you thought was weakness. But let me tell you something, Texans don't see weakness when they see this chair. They see proof that a man can face tragedy, adapt, and still lead with strength. What do Californians see when they look at you? A leader, or a showman who cracks jokes while his state falls apart? The audience erupted again, half laughing, half roaring with applause. Newsom's lips tightened, and he finally tried to interject. "Greg, with all due respect." But Abbott cut him off, not rudely, but firmly. "No, Governor. With all due respect, you had your chance. You used it to mock instead of to lead. And now the people watching at home see exactly who you are." The hall thundered. Journalists' cameras flashed like fireworks, capturing the image of Newsom shrinking back as Abbott pressed forward with the force of a prosecutor delivering his closing argument. Abbott paused, letting the roar wash over him, before lowering his tone to something almost intimate, almost personal. "You tried to make this about my chair. But tonight, America learned it was never about that. It was about who stands strong when tested. And you, Governor Newsom, just failed the test." The eruption of cheers was deafening. Even some who had come undecided were on their feet now, chanting Abbott's name, as Gavin Newsom sat frozen in silence, his earlier arrogance erased. The hall was still trembling with applause when Abbott leaned back in his chair, calm, collected, the storm behind his eyes finally subsiding. He waited until the chants of "Abbott, Abbott" softened into a hum, then spoke with a quiet conviction that carried more weight than any shout could. "Governor Newsom," Abbott said evenly, "tonight you tried to turn a disability into a punchline. But in doing so, you revealed more about yourself than about me. Leadership isn't about mocking others. It isn't about smirks or sound bites. Leadership is about grit. It's about service. It's about standing firm when the world expects you to fall." The crowd, silent now, leaned in closer, every ear tuned to his words. "You thought this chair was a weakness. But let me tell you, it's been my greatest teacher. It taught me that strength isn't measured by how tall you stand, but by how steady you stay when the ground shakes. Texans understand that. Americans understand that. And after tonight, they see the truth. Resilience will always outshine ridicule." The hall erupted one final time, a tidal wave of cheers and stomping boots. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment Abbott turned an insult into his strongest weapon yet. Newsom sat motionless, his smirk long gone, his polished aura shattered under the weight of Abbott's words. For once, he had no comeback. And as the moderator declared the debate concluded, one thing was undeniable: what was meant to humiliate Greg Abbott had become the night's most powerful display of strength, a moment that would echo far beyond the walls of that debate hall.